Welcome everybody. This evening, we have with us the well-known contemporary artist, Sumakshi Singh, and she's going to share her creative process with us. But before we begin, for those who haven't been with us before, I would like to introduce our organization and perhaps talk a little about our upcoming events, which we'll come to at the end. Before that, let me introduce the institution and our speaker for today. Jnanapravaha Mumbai is a para-academic institute that offers public programs and postgraduate courses in the history of aesthetics, critical theory, art criticism, and writing style since 2007. The institute brings scholars at the cutting edge of their fields from India and abroad to teach students and the public and to develop and share new work in courses, conferences, and workshops. Since our inception, over 1,500 students have studied postgraduate level courses with us. JPM, Jnanapravaha Mumbai, remains committed to offering Mumbai a space for rigorous pedagogy, research, reading, and writing. JPM's aesthetics section includes postgraduate diploma and certificate courses in Indian aesthetics, Southeast Asian art and architecture, yoga and tantra, Islamic aesthetics, and Buddhist aesthetics. Our criticism and theory section offers certificate courses in aesthetics, criticism and theory, and seminars in Indian intellectual traditions. Apart from this, JPM offers additional programming for students and the public under not only these rubrics, but also creative practices, which we are going to do today, curatorial processes, and community engagement. Sumakshi Singh's immersive installations are invitations into worlds of shifting perceptions, fracturing illusions, slower rhythms of time, and fluid, figure-grounded relationships to explore the basis of how we assign attention, construct meaning, and perceive our realities within and without. Our everyday givens are questioned as her work dissolves familiar forms and intimate memories into insubstantial mirages using perspective, eroding surfaces, or using gossamer, web-like skins of thread and lace. Join us as Sumakshi Singh walks us through 23 years of her interdisciplinary creative practice, discussing the roles of accident, inspiration, type, history, personal memory, and metaphysics in making visual art. Sumakshi Singh is an artist and educator. This is a short bio of the artist. May I request Sumakshi to lower the volume slightly? Thank you, because we want people to hear about you. Sumakshi Singh is an artist and an educator who taught at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and lectured at Oxford University, Columbia University, among other museums and colleges. Her work has been presented in gallery and museum exhibitions in Australia, India, UK, China, USA, Canada, France, Italy, Serbia, and Switzerland. Exhibition venues include the Gallery of Modern Art, Queensland, Saatchi Gallery, London, Kochi Biennale, Kochi, Museum of Contemporary Art at Lyon, MAXXI Museum, Maxi Museum, Rome, the Mattress Factory Museum of Contemporary Art, Pittsburgh Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, and KNAM MA, India. She has mentored residencies for Victoria and Albert Museum, the Why Not Place 2010 and 11, and was a visiting artist advisor at Khoj, Delhi. Singh received her Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting, Drawing, and Art History from MSU, that's Maharaja Sayaji Rao University, Baroda, India, in 2001, and her BFA in Painting and Drawing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, of course, Illinois, USA, in 2003. She is the recipient of several awards, including the Asia Arts Future Game Changer Award by the Asia Society in 2022 and the Y Flow Award in 2019. Before I hand over to Sumakshi, I want to just talk about a couple of courses that are coming up. Of course, they will be in July. They will begin in July because we close for summer. May and June are months when Jnanapravaha does not work. So from July 14th to September 23rd, 2025, from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. IST, mainly on Tuesdays, Jnanapravaha begins its next iteration in aesthetics, criticism, and theory, titled Conjuring Empire, Art, Faith, and Power in the Byzantine World, by 10 renowned scholars, to be held online on Zoom. And of course, from July 2025 to April 2026, from 1:30 to 5:30 p.m., usually on Saturdays, Jnanapravaha begins its next iteration of the postgraduate course in Indian aesthetics, to be held in hybrid mode. So it will be physical in our space and online on Zoom. And of course, this lecture is part of the IA course as well. For the IA course, registrations open on our website in the month of May, 1st May. And I think the following week, you can enroll for Conjuring Empire, Art, Faith, and Power in the Byzantine World. And with that, without wasting any time, I hand over to our guest for today, who's sitting in her studio and has, so we see her beautiful art already. Sumakshi, thank you for doing this for us. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening. So I have many different bodies of work. And you know what? I'm just going to try and figure out how to, yes, sorry, I'm still figuring my way around Zoom a little bit. Okay. I think that should do it. Okay. No, doesn't like that.
So if you need help, Sharon, if you could ask and she'll do whatever she is required.
So I'm just wondering, is there any option that where I can just see a couple of tabs, or do everything gets minimized or everything gets opened?
As in, you're talking about the Zoom window that you are on the present.
Everybody's faces. So I'm just
Okay.
wondering because it's blocking my screen, so I can't quite see.
I request everybody to please put off their videos while the presentation is on, and we can turn them on when you're doing the Q&A. How's that? That will help, right? And then if you go to the view section,
Yeah.
you can say
I've got it.
Yeah, you can
I've
say
got it.
side by, yes, and hide self view, so you don't see any windows at all.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So I have many, many different bodies of work. I work with thread, as you can see behind me right now. I map illusions in spaces. I've worked with tiny sculptures in the wall. I've done painting and drawing. I work with video and animation. And today what I'm going to do is talk about these different bodies of work and, just try and develop this overall picture of my art practice for over the last 24 years or so. So I'd like to start with this painting that I made while I was still doing my bachelor's in painting and drawing in Baroda. And this painting is called Pondicherry. And it's about the 1 month I spent in Pondicherry. And I used this canvas pretty much like one would use a diary. So there was this sort of daily journaling activity that was happening on it. And what I'd do is I'd go out in the city, I'd have an experience, then I would come back and I would paint it. And then I would go out, I would have another experience, and I would come back and paint it as another layer over that first layer. And so layer by layer by layer, this thing starts to build up into this almost autobiographical palimpsest where you can see, the most current narrative the most clearly, but you do see the traces of the past through these translucent layers as well. And when I first arrived in Pondicherry, not knowing a lot about the city, I started by painting maps of the area where I was staying. So it started with this, symbolic idea of the city. And over time, I started to have more interactions in the city, and I started to represent those on the canvas. So somewhere there, you see like drawings of these little chickens that were running around in the backyard. Or up on top are the lyrics to this Alan Parsons song that I was listening to at the time. And this is a gentleman from my pottery class who I've painted. And on his back, I've taken thread and, embroidered this pattern that I had noticed that some of the weaves in Auroville had. So there was this attempt to start getting the piece to be a little bit more materially specific as well. And then by the end of my time in Pondicherry, I was going on these long walks and I would just pick up things as I was walking down the road. And there was like the bark of a banana tree. There was, this dry, dead fish that I found on the beach. And all these things end up getting stuck on the canvas as well. So for me, this painting became about these distances of interaction with a place, from the idea of a place to the representation of a place to finally the presentation of things directly from that place. And this layering of vantage points is something that I start to explore further in my illusion-based projects later on. And I like to start with this painting because I feel like it holds these little keys and clues to things that, I was struggling with, that I was trying to resolve. And one of those things was my relationship with the frame of the image. So I always had this uncomfortable relationship with the frame. I felt like these paintings had a very centrifugal energy to them, like they wanted to burst outwards. And they were so full of all these little marks and details and layers, and that frame always seemed to be like forcibly squeezing it all in. And if I loosened that frame, then everything was going to explode and like splatter all over the wall. And so I was always uncomfortable with figuring out, how to bracket visual information. And this is again something that shows up in some of the later work. These were the figure drawings I was doing at the time. And I really loved doing these figure drawings. And for me, they were basically an excuse to explore surface and texture and mark making and pattern, rather than say structure or volume or three-dimensionality. And often what would happen is that the patterns from one part of the image, like from this cactus plant, for example, would start to leak in, to the body of the figure behind, or the negative space behind the figure would sort of breach its boundaries and start to permeate the objects in the foreground. So I think I just about started to explore these more fluid figure-ground relationships. And then we went on this field trip from college to the Ajanta Ellora caves. And I was really taken by these, flaking islands of images that time had left behind, and these voids that it had created in the middle. And I found these voids really active and pulsating with possibility, because my mind was constantly creating new ways to bridge this part of the narrative with that part of the narrative. And I saw how these transitional spaces were opening up the read of what I was looking at, and also having the work go from representation into abstraction and back to representation. And then I moved to Chicago to do my master's in 2003 at the Art Institute. And, none of my old sources of inspiration were readily available. And that's the image on the right, my old sources of inspiration. And the image on the left is what Chicago looks like. So I was really struggling. I was having a hard time sketching. I was having a hard time finding what inspired me. I also realized when I was sketching, my hand just naturally used to move in curved lines, and I would go out into the city and everything was just this grid and straight lines. And, so I felt like I couldn't even draw the way I naturally wanted to. But there was some momentum from my past language of painting that continued for the first few months that I was in Chicago. And I was making these large paintings on canvas and on paper. And I was uncomfortable with them. So then I'd end up cutting them up and ripping them up and then realigning them and stitching them back up. And again, cutting them up and realigning them and stitching them back up. So they would go through all these like death and resurrection cycles. And also what I was doing is I was trying to shape the canvases so that the shape or the edge of that canvas would somehow echo the gesture or the mark that was inside. So again, I was looking for this other kind of relationship, a more cohesive relationship between the surface and the image that I was creating on that surface. And at this point, we had Jerry Saltz coming in as a visiting critic. And he said something that really made me think. And he said that, your painting doesn't have any middle ground viewing distance, which means that because it's really big, it's like 14 feet large. He said, I can walk into the room and then from the doorway, I can see this like huge shape on the wall and some of these big gestures. But the next optimum place for me to view your painting is like from 2 inches away. Like I can see all these marks and textures and things on the surface, but there's nothing in the middle. And I was thinking about this, and finally I decided that, if that's where the work was going naturally anyway, then why don't I embrace it for a while and just, see what happens. And so I started making these really tiny, meticulous little paintings on these bits of baked polymer clay, and started to rearrange them and play with them and put them around in the space. And I feel like this material, polymer clay, like really saved me at this time because, it was a craft material. It was really easy to manipulate. I didn't have the pressure that I put on myself with trying to make these large, successful paintings. If one didn't work, I could just put it away and make another one. And so somehow it allowed me to loosen up and to start to play again. And some of these pieces started to get more sculptural. And what would happen is, friends coming into the studio or my mentors would start to ask me these questions like, oh, those two tiny holes in the wall on the lower left side of that piece, are they part of your work? And I got quite interested in this thing that was happening, that because of the scale of the work, the architecture behind it, which was normally invisible, was somehow gaining some kind of presence and some sort of voice. And I thought, how can I exaggerate this further, or how can I use this? And so I started to intervene much more strongly into the walls, and I started to have the walls bubble up, and I would add plaster, or I would stain the wall, I would add nails, basically use this sort of language of things that one might find naturally on a wall. This is a piece made out of carved wood and polymer clay, and it's inserted inside the wall, and it's just about 3 inches big. And none of these pieces are usually at eye level. So they're all around the periphery of the room, and you walk into a room that looks a little bit either empty or just a bit scarred. And then, moment to moment, one starts to discover these micro interventions. This work is called Urban Fungus, and it's 1.5 inches big, and it weaves in and out of the wall. And it's made out of polymer clay and Vaseline and moss and fungus and papaya seeds and nails and all sorts of things. And to, make this tiny piece, actually, and this is something, I always find amusing, is I basically had to build the whole wall. And so when you come like 2 days before the piece is ready, the studio has this, it has aluminum studs, it has wood, it has construction materials and drills and plaster. And all of this is like the, the kind of heavy backstory to create this really delicate, quiet, unobtrusive moment. And when you look through this, the hole in this sculpture, what you see is this red diorama behind it that has these papaya seeds that are sprouting during the course of the exhibition. But this diorama is not quite the right word for it, because it's not a contained pocket of activity. Because when you step back from it, what you're looking at is this, which is there are a few more holes in the wall, there's more moss growing on a side, there's a few more of these mushroom forms. When you step back from this, there's still more. And you step back from this, and there's still more. Until essentially your walls and your floor and the ceiling all start to look like these saturated, proliferating membranes that are full of activity. And the viewing of it becomes quite abstract. It's almost like, taking a series of fragments from your peripheral vision and just letting it build into something. I now, as I'm just saying this right now, I'm thinking a little bit about, moving from Baroda to Chicago, and the critique systems were so different. And now that I think about it, in Baroda, no one ever asked me, what does your work mean, or what is your work about? And what was always discussed were these sort of peripheral things, the layering, the nuances, how the paint has been applied. Why does that change the reading? If this gesture is aggressive, it pushes you away. If this is tiny, it's intimate, it's pulling you in. Just all these tiny things would be discussed, and somehow the content was building up cumulatively as we were discussing all these little details. So I wonder if that's partly what triggered this way of making work. Also, what would happen is when my photographer would come in to take the photos of these pieces, he would always ask me, okay, how do you want me to frame this? Is it just that piece, or is it that piece with those two blobs under it? Or is it that piece with the two blobs and that one mushroom on the corner? Where is the frame? And this is what I had also been looking for with the paintings, is to somehow open that bracket, open that visual bracket, and all these pieces start to migrate into each other's territories until essentially there's no transitional voids left anymore, because the architecture itself starts being, observed. Also with this piece, those little red wires that you see on the lower left of the piece, like I've actually, painted the shadows of those, inspired by a friend of mine, Paula Cabal, who was obsessed with light and shadows. I think she still is. And also this, the pink mushroom, the reflection you see under it is painted. And it's humorous also, I think, to take, these silly little things. I mean, do they mean something? I don't know. But this question of how much is natural and how much is constructed starts to come up in the work. And one of the reasons for this is that I had moved from Baroda, where you see trees growing out of the sides of buildings, and this very quirky, organic interaction between nature and architecture, to this in Chicago. And downtown Chicago is, I think, arguably one of the most manicured areas in the world, or at least it was at the time. And it was the first time that I saw the natural landscape be turned into another form of architecture. And to me, this was a landscape that spoke of human control and boxed categories, and this manicured, manipulated nature that was subservient to human will. It was for human consumption. And these tulips, which is a story that I love to tell, I think inspired this entire body of work that's coming up. So we would go through this really long winter in Chicago, many, many months where, You don't even see a leaf on a tree. It's all just bare because it's so cold. And you wake up one morning and this entire downtown area of Chicago is flooded with these fully bloomed tulips. And you never actually saw them grow. And a few weeks later, just as mysteriously, you wake up one morning and they've all disappeared. You never see them die. And to me, it felt quite odd at the time to have just this one part of a nuanced and complex natural cycle isolated and presented for human consumption. It seemed to be placing value solely on that moment of climax, the moment of bloom, and saying that it's okay to bypass the journey and here is what you really want. And, it's a sort of immediate gratification. And I experienced this value system as impoverished. I didn't like the editing of this story. And so something in me wanted to start perverting the sterility of all these perfect surfaces. And so a lot of the work that I was doing at the time started to resemble weeds in the sidewalk, or, that part of nature that hadn't yet been pre-processed and packaged for easy human digestion. And this work, which started off so playfully, I think started to find a more subversive tone in a way. And so these are details from the floor of a gallery, which I had like scooped out and inserted these little microcosms into. But from eye level, like that's what it looks like. It looks like almost nothing. And I often think that the viewing of these requires one to see almost in the way that I imagine an infant sees things, where you're either a little bit too zoomed in or too zoomed out to make immediate sense of what you're looking at. And that world hasn't yet been divided into objects and background. That separation hasn't fully happened. And so everything is equally important. And, like the infants, sometimes you're trying to show them this toy and you're like, look at this. And you realize they're like looking actually at your sleeve instead of the toy. So that hierarchy of vision hasn't come in that said, look at the tulips, don't look at the weeds. And then, here I am in the gallery creating all these lumps and bumps and cracks and marks and holes. But there's always so much in this space that I haven't done. It's pre-existing. And viewers coming into the gallery are often confronted with this question of how much is pre-existing and how much is artistic intervention. So that crack on the wall, like, has that been created by the artist? Was it a pre-existing crack? Has it been amplified? Was it accidentally forgotten? In other words, how much of this is part of the art and how much of it is not? And this is something that each viewer sets or releases their own boundaries for this, for when they allow something to become part of the art viewing experience. And so the agency starts to shift to the viewers in a way. And they start to become, co-producers of this art viewing experience. And what happens then is also, if this crack is part of the work, then what about that crack? And then what about the crack that's just outside the gallery? What happens to that one, And I find people have many different ways of looking at this work. There's some that just relax immediately into this childlike way of looking, where they're just observing these things and they can just look at things without naming them, without trying to identify the object. So you just sort of sink into this way of seeing where everything, is coming in and out. It's more abstract. There are others that try to quantify the experience. So for example, I remember during this show, especially with this piece, I had a viewer come in and ask me, like, I was here yesterday and that nail wasn't there on the wall. Have you added it after I left yesterday? And, this sort of almost a paranoia to make sure that you've contained that experience. And what would start to happen is, because the work invited this kind of slow attentiveness, some people would find it hard to switch it off once they left the gallery. So I'd have people calling me saying that, you know, I'm at the red line at this metro station and there's like a hole in the wall and there's got fungus in it. Is this your artwork? Or they'd say, you know, I'm looking at these weeds in my garden differently now, or something or the other. And I started to see how this gallery could serve as like a highlighter tool that was highlighting things that were already present, but perhaps for some reason not always visible. And I was also thinking a bit about how, you know, like for example, here on the right side, this crack that you're looking at, now this is almost an artificial history that I'm creating of this space. It's a tiny crack. It's made with, like I've painted one layer of orange, waited for it to dry, one layer of blue, waited for it to dry, then orange again, waited for it to dry, then etc., etc., etc. And there's like 20 layers of paint, and then covered them with plaster and then cracked it open. So what I wanted with this was for this tiny crack to serve as a little portal so that if a viewer looks into it, then suddenly the imagination allows you to suddenly, you know, think of this whole gallery as being orange or blue or something like that. And while this is an artificially created history, what starts to happen is it's calling for a way of looking and a quality of attention that then allows people to go out and reevaluate their own familiar visual environments in ways that they haven't done before. So in that way, I feel like the pieces almost become like decoys because people are spending more time looking at the space between the pieces. And what was earlier just the background ends up becoming the foreground. And so the ground starts to become the figure. I am now going to move a little bit faster. Okay. This was a solo show I did in 2003 in Chicago, and it was called Void. And because the gallery looked empty and the show was called Void, many people came to the entrance and turned around and left thinking the show had been canceled and there was nothing in there to see. We had, at this point, Mani Kaul, who was a well-known Indian filmmaker, come to visit us in Chicago. And he told us this really interesting story. He was learning Drupad music from his Guruji, and he noticed that some of the other students were making mistakes. And he asked his Guruji, like, how come you're not correcting their mistakes? And his teacher gave a really interesting answer, saying that I'm waiting to see if they do it again. Because if they do it once or twice, maybe it's just a mistake. But if they do it more than 3 times, it could be their style. And at this point, I was teaching figure drawing in Chicago as well. And I had noticed this with many of my students is there was something that always frustrated them. Like, you know, one person would say, oh, my drawing always gets too dark. Or one would say it always gets too angular. Or my frame always gets cropped. And I had seen that for many of them, that flaw that kept repeating itself despite their best intentions not to let it, sometimes was like a portal that led to them finding their voice and finding what their unique creative response to what they were seeing was. And so I was thinking about this also with the gallery space. And I was thinking that, you know, there's the idea of the gallery space, which is that it is a neutral white ground upon which one rests some sort of cultural activity. But then there is also the physical reality of this space, which is that every space is saturated with its own qualities and neutrality is actually impossible. And I thought about, well, how can I exaggerate the tension between these two perceptions of the space, the cultural and the natural? And I wanted to do it by exaggerating the pre-existing flaws in this space. So here, there was a leak in the ceiling. And so I went up and I actually unscrewed the pipes to exaggerate this leak. And then I built this central piece that looked almost like a pool that could collect the water as it was dropping. So when it was raining outside, that pool was filling up. When it was dry outside, it would leave these concentric traces. So this became like a focal point for the show. And then along the periphery and edges, to echo this, I would paint all these water damage stains. I was also playing with scale shifts in this show. So one was, the microcosmic interventions where when you look at them, because they're really detailed and they seem like these complete worlds, they seem to somehow expand as one is looking at them, and one sort of enters them through their consciousness and can also almost navigate this miniature landscape. But I wanted another version of the scale shift where I could literally map out a feeling of infinity. So I built this wall and I cracked it, and I placed these two mirrors on the side to stretch out this floor. This was, and this is what I love about Chicago. I was invited to do an art project inside an elevator. And this is what the elevator looks like. On the right side is what the elevator really looks like. On the left side is what I did with it. And this elevator had been stalled since the Great Chicago Fire in 1893. So it had pretty much never been used. And when I was asked to do something as an art project in this elevator, I first thought like, oh, I want to extend the space vertically because an elevator goes up and down, and play with that. But then the more I thought about it, I said, this elevator has never really welcomed human beings in there. And it's more a glass box to be looked into rather than one to be traversed in. And so I decided to extend the space horizontally. And what I did is I replicated the doorway of this elevator twice more. And I built this kind of trapezoid box that exaggerated the perspective so that it actually looked like it was going back much deeper into space. And people coming in there looking at it said that, oh, I feel like I'm caught between the reflections of these two parallel mirrors, but for some reason, my body is not in it. And that was, sort of perfect for what I wanted, because this was an elevator that had, pretty much rejected human presence. This was a show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago in 2004, where I traced all the cracks in the sidewalk outside the museum. And then I built this floor for this room and I routed out these cracks. And I fitted them in with these watery looking interventions, which were made out of plexiglass and resin. So this show happened in April, which is a rainy month in Chicago. And I wanted there to be this visual continuity as when people are coming into the gallery from, outside the museum and seeing the sidewalk and seeing these little rivulets that are trapped in the cracks, to when they enter the gallery. So I just want to say one thing about this show. There was this fish pond, which was right below the gallery where I was showing my work. And I would always see these people sitting by this fish pond and looking at these fish. And these were all people that had been probably looking at too much art and just feeling really saturated and just needed a break and needed to just come look at these fish for a while. And I was thinking about, how is that way of looking at the fish different from the way we look at art? And what permission do we give ourselves to switch how we look at things? And so I took one of these watery interventions made out of plexiglass out of the gallery and around the corner, and it trickled down the steps into the fish pond below. And I saw people sitting there and they'd see it from the corner of their eye and mostly ignore it. And then as they were walking up the steps, I saw some of them looking at it with a little more suspicion. Is it maybe art? And then as they approached the gallery and they approached the threshold of this space where they were now ready to witness intellectual or cultural activity on that side of it, they suddenly saw that, the work was connected and, oh yes, it's part of the art, and ran back down the steps to look at it with a different kind of attention. So for me, it was an interesting study of how we give ourselves permission to regard things differently. And how does that permission shift our perceptions of things and shift what we think they mean? This is after I came back to India, and I'm going to skip this body of work. But basically, I was, making these frottage rubbings of all the graffiti I found in these public monuments and the tombs. I traced out the handwritings. I created these walls out of them. This was an abandoned factory in upstate New York, which I was really attracted to, as seeing the state of entropy and peeling paint. And so I did a series of these drawings that were layered paper drawings that resembled these peeling walls. And this led to a show that I had in Zurich in 2008. And from the main street, when one looked, it looked like that there was a wall in front that had split in half. And this was done with layers and layers and layers of painted paper that I had stuck together and then cut and carved into. And the show had all these micro interventions. And then as you round the corner, you come into the core of the gallery, where, inspired by that upstate New York factory, I wanted this space to look like it had literally exploded, and that the walls were peeling so fiercely that it looked like they were in full bloom. And all of these peeling interventions was done with layers of paper. And the back, I had tinted this kind of mossy, fungusy green color, so it would create a reflection of the wall and give it that, feeling. And the paintings and drawings are something that, continue through all the bodies of work, and it's still very much, my baseline. And one can see maybe how the language of the interventions draws from these paintings, the patterning. And they're mostly images of patterns extracted from nature, tessellations, ruptures, pollen bursts, etc. And then some of the sketches are a little more realistic, looking at reflections, etc. So in 2006, I was invited to do this public art project in New York. And I walked down Houston Street and I traced out all the holes in the sidewalk that I found there. And I created these paintings, which were acrylic on canvas, and I poured layers of resin on them, and then I embedded them back into these holes in the sidewalk. So it looked like it had just rained and there were all these puddles of water all over the street. And when you stop to look into one of these puddles, they're actually accurate in perspective. So the face that you see there, if I was to see it from my eye level, would be around 1.72 inches. And so that's what the size of that face was. And all of these puddles that you see are accurate in space, but not actually accurate in time. And what I mean by this is that the trees that you're seeing in this reflection were actually around this puddle, except that now it's summertime and they have foliage. And this is an image of the trees in winter. Then on the upper right side, what you see is the reflection of the underside of an umbrella of a fruit cart vendor from Mexico that used to work on this street that had been deported. And on the lower right, you see the reflection of this building that used to be there 50 years ago, but had been demolished because of gentrification. And this is some information that I'd found about the building by visiting the Historic and Landmark Society and doing a bit of research. So part of the research was, going to these institutions and researching in a more formal manner. And then part of the research was simply, like for the Mexican fruit cart vendor that had been deported, part of that research was just talking to people on the road. Also because, I was there tracing out the holes in the sidewalk, and people would keep stopping by to look at me and say, oh, good, are you going to finally fix these holes? Okay, great. And they'd stop by to talk to me and, and then just tell me stories about the neighborhood. So they became like these little space-time hiccups, or these little stutters in perception, that people could kind of access these little portals of history as they were walking through the neighborhood. And at the same time that I was creating these pieces, I was on residency in upstate New York, and I made this artwork called Average Utopia. And I was reading The Little Prince, and in that he mentioned how his planet is so small that whenever he's depressed, all he has to do is just move his chair and he can see a sunset. And one day he just kept moving his chair and he saw the sunset 44 times. And I was really charmed by the poetry of this eternal sunset. But I was also thinking about this idea of immediate gratification and the tulips, and, what if you can always have your sunset, and what happens to, if you don't have to wait for this climactic moment, and what does it do to desire if you start to divorce it from time, if you don't have to wait, if you can have whatever you want whenever you want. And so I created this fiberglass and resin piece that looked like the reflection of a sunset on water. Then I attached it to the back of a boat and I rowed around the lake with my sunset attached to me. And then I installed it in the lake so that morning, noon on demand, morning, noon on night, you had this like sunset on demand. And I really wanted to make this out of colored ice so that the sunset could finally melt, but that project still hasn't happened. So all of this working with perspective and puddles made me aware of how unstable our perceptions are and how contingent they are on exactly where we're standing. And I was just looking at, everyday objects in the studio, just like ladders and stools, etc., and seeing how my vision was flattening out this three-dimensional object into a two-dimensional image that was obliterating the architecture that was behind it. And this image or this perception, again, was so fragile that if I moved my head just 1 inch, that image would break and the architecture behind would start to reveal itself. And I was noticing how in perspective, something is always hidden, something is always exaggerated. And for the first time, the mechanics of just everyday seeing, everyday vision had started to feel quite mysterious to me. And I wanted to just spend time with it in space to see how is this actually working. So I had this really ridiculously slow, labor-intensive process where I first created the drawing of this staircase. Well, first there was a staircase that was 5 feet tall that I placed in front of me. And then I stood with one eye closed and a sheet of glass and I traced out the drawing of the staircase. Then moved the staircase and then I was looking through that drawing on glass into the space behind. And then I had an assistant who was running around in space, making marks on the floor and on the wall based on what I was telling her I was seeing. So I would tell her, no, please, a little more to the left, a little more to the right. And sometimes I would tell her, okay, 2 inches to the left. And it turned out it was 10 feet to the left. And so it was a really interesting study for me to see just, how foreign our own perceptions can get. And we finally ended up with these splattered geometric shapes that lined up from one angle to look like this 5-foot tall ladder standing in space. And the big surprise to me was when I saw people moving through it, because it looked like these solid forms were suddenly intersecting each other and defying some kind of law of physics. And so then I started to think about, what do I want to use this language for now that and I did a few more projects in between that one and the one I'm about to show you, where I was trying to work out the language of it. And, so my immediate family, which is my parents, my brother and I, we moved around a lot. My father had a transferable job. And so every 2 or 3 years, we lived in a different house in a different state. And so we didn't have any one place that we thought of as home. And the only place that consistently remained home was my grandparents' house, 33 Link Road, which spurs a whole other body of work later. And so year after year, we would just come back to this house and everything seemed very comfortingly frozen in this house. The mattis were always in this one container on the left side in the kitchen, and the cotton wool was always in that top drawer. So there was a familiarity and this feeling that, we knew what where everything was and what everything was. And we spent a lot of time in the living room of this house, which was full of these objects that my grandfather had spent a lifetime collecting. And none of these objects were actually very precious, I think, monetarily, but they all had these incredible stories behind them. And so, for example, this painting, so my grandfather was an arms and ammunitions dealer, and he spent a lot of time visiting the palaces of the old Maharajas and the princes who were trying to get rid of their ammunition in their armory because they no longer had any use for it. And so on one such occasion, this Maharaja presented him a box of cartridges for which my grandfather quoted a price. And the Maharaja said, no, that's too low. And my grandfather said, well, only 50% of these are actually going to work. And the Maharaja, in good old Maharaja style, said, bring me a gun. And he said, if you're right, you can have anything you want in the palace. And so then they loaded the gun and they fired 10 bullets. And it so happened that 5 worked and 5 didn't. So he told my grandfather, take what you want. And so my grandfather saw this painting lying in the garbage. And he said, you know what, I'll take that. But why is it lying in the garbage? And the Maharaja said, this is the view from my mother's bedroom. And she used to love this view and she used to look at it every day. And then when she became bedridden, she could no longer look at it. She couldn't stand up anymore. So we hired a painter to paint this view, and we hung it as this painting across her bed so she could look at it as she was dying. But now she's dead and nobody wants this painting. And now, so this painting is in my grandfather's living room. So this living room was full of all these stories. And after he died in 2006, I had this very uncanny experience where I was walking through this space that he had occupied and the space that was so familiar to me. And somehow, although I knew what all these objects were, they no longer felt the same to me. So there was this gap between my perception of them and my knowledge of them. Like I knew what they were, but I didn't know how to feel about them anymore. And to process this gap between the perception and knowledge, I drew out the illusion of his living room on all the pre-existing objects in my studio in France where I was staying. So I drew it on a trash can, on a chair, on a canvas, on the walls, on a shelf, on a little jar, on everything. And I did this in such a way that basically then from the vantage point of the entrance, as you walk into the room, the drawn image obliterates the real. And as one starts to walk in, this image slowly starts to skew and break apart. And the back of these real objects start to reveal themselves. It's like a little, like a little stutter in perception. Sorry, I'm going to take a sip. It's like a little stutter in perception where it's almost like your vision got stuck in space and then you're allowed to walk into another moment in time and inspect this abstract map of your own vision from another angle. And so as viewers would walk through this skewing, fracturing, disorienting world, they would also simultaneously see themselves online, on screen, where on screen they were in the lined up illusion of my grandfather's living room. And so bodies really slowed down as they were trying to negotiate being in multiple spaces at the same time and trying to understand what the implication of an action they create in this space is going to have, in that particular space. And this work was called Mapping the Memory Mandala, with the idea being that, I made it out of chalk pastel, with the idea being that as people walk in and start moving through this space, then it will start to erase and blur and disappear. And I can say goodbye to that fixed memory of my grandfather's living room. So now there is a new process, which I'm going to show you a video of, but basically now there is a camera looking through the drawing on glass into the space. And I'm running around in space. And I can see what the camera is seeing because I've connected it to a projector. So I'm running around in space trying to make what looks like a two-dimensional drawing on three-dimensional objects by matching my mark making to what I'm seeing in the projection. Hopefully it'll be clearer when I show you the video. Okay. So here is a short video. I'm just going to move through the video a little fast now. And I'm going to skip a little bit again. That's people walking through. And I've collected the dust from this project. Okay, I'm now going to skip talking about this part of the project. And maybe talk about, yes, I will talk about this part. So at this point, this is 2011, where I drew out the illusion of my bedroom as a black and white drawing for the India Art Fair, which was then called the India Art Summit. I had been meditating for a few years at this point, and I had been studying yoga philosophy. And I was thinking quite a lot about how the yogis said that this world is actually illusory in construct. And it only seems real to us because we put our energy into our belief that it's real. And I asked myself, what would it feel like if I hung out in a space for a month where I knew that everything I was interacting with was illusory? And so I did that. So I created, I created this illusion, and then I started to interact with all these drawn objects as if they were real. And then I created this animation out of it, which is about 12 minutes long, but you're going to see just a minute and a half. And this is done so I draw the brush, I pose with it, and I take a photo. And then I erase the brush and I redraw it an inch away, pose with it, take a photo, and so on and so forth. So it's like a really old-fashioned stop motion animation technique that is done physically in the space. And I'm just going to, again, jump forward a little bit. So here I'm drawing the cup on my shirt and on my face. And there's a moment where it starts to sort of, break apart. And so you can always see this on my website if you like. Later that same year, I was invited to do this show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Lyon. And for this show, I went back to the language of the micro interventions. And at this point, I had spent a good amount of time in Italy and France and really fallen in love with these pre-Renaissance frescoes by Giotto and Cimabue, for example. So for two reasons, I think. I mean, one was that they, married my, one was that they had the same thing, these like flaking amoeboid images that had been left behind by time. And they were like these parts that were always seeking the whole. And the second was that mathematical perspective had only been discovered as a formula during the Renaissance. So before that, the artists would always draw these buildings in perspective simply by, using their eyes, which is what I was doing as well. But they never quite got it right. So it was always awkward. And these figures always seemed to be in a non-place, like, they didn't quite belong. And so I created this ceiling piece for the museum that looked like a flaking fresco that had all these art historical characters that were collaged and drawn on it. And this is part of the process. And there were also these animations I had created where these characters would walk out of their paintings and enter real environments that were embedded in these behind the wall on these little screens that were playing. And so here he's looking at this little hole in the floor, which has this animation of the angel Gabriel that is moving around. And then this show moved to the Maxi Museum in Rome. And that was a very different space. It was a space designed by Zaha Hadid that had long curving corridors and quite a hard space to curate shows in. And so what the curators decided to do was, just build a bunch of boxes inside the museum, these partition walls, and give, each artist a box. But I didn't really want to work inside one of those boxes. So then I asked them, do you have another space that I can use? And they said, okay, well, we've got this 56-foot long corridor here, if it's of any use to you. And, I said, great. So I took this corridor and I converted it to look like this cross-vaulted ceiling of an old church, and projected on it from above. So you can see the projectors were again these animations of these art historical characters that seem to now be walking around all over the ceiling. And these are some of my process shots. Okay. So in 2014, I was invited to be a part of the Kochi Biennale. And when I talk about this project, I sometimes jokingly tell people that what I ended up making was not plan B, it was like plan K. It was not A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. And what I ended up doing finally was I was given this space that was about 70 feet long and 30 feet wide. And in this space, I hung many scrolls of paper that were about 12 feet high. And on these scrolls of paper, I painted images or portions of images, all of which referred to the history of Kerala. So here, for example, all the plants that I'm painting are taken from this 17th century Dutch encyclopedia called the Hortus Malabaricus, which documents 720 plant varieties from the Malabar area. And here, right in front, if you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm going to just circle that. There's an animation. So I made multiple animations for it, but this particular animation shows the Portuguese sailing ship coming in to Kerala. And I found out from an astrologer where all these constellations were on May 20th, 1498 in Calicut, which is that moment and that place where Vasco da Gama landed. And this whole, this whole new history of interaction and influence from the Portuguese was about to begin in Kerala, like this sort of moment destined in the stars, which is, what this animation was about. And then there was some animations based off the Surya Siddhant, which is a 4th century text, which, if we have more time later, I can tell you about. But all these little fractured images and animations and all these things lined up from one particular vantage point at the front of the room to look like an open manuscript book that had all these histories of Kerala in it. And then the viewers sees themselves as a character in the book, sort of becoming like the latest, addition to Kerala's history. So this is a quick video that I'm going to again skip through. This is the animation from the Surya Siddhant. That is Vasco da Gama exchanging gold for pepper with the Samudri Raja. And these are people walking through it and looking at themselves in this screen, which is shaped like a book being held up by this angel-like figure. So I'm going to skip. Okay. So when you actually first enter the room, what you see in the back of the room is a table with this tiny little book on it. And as you look into this book, you start to see that there is movement in it, and the birds are flying and people are moving. But at this point, people don't know that this is live feed coming from the front of the room. And then they slowly, turn around and enter the installation from the back. And as they approach the front of the room, they start to see that, then they become a character in that book as well. Okay. And now the last project I'm going to talk about before we take a break. Earlier that year, actually not later that year, a few months earlier, I was in Vancouver. I was invited to participate in the Vancouver Biennale. And the theme of this Biennale was cross borders. And while this was responded to by most artists and interpreted as cross-cultural, I was thinking about breath, partly because I had been studying yoga, but also because I chose to do this project not in Vancouver, the city, but a smaller place right outside it called Squamish, which is really beautiful. And Squamish in the First Nations people's language actually means mother of the wind. So I was thinking breath would be an appropriate thing to work with there. I thought of breath as something, that's very intimate. It's inside us. But once exhaled, it's sort of floating freely in this current, and then it's going to be received by someone else. And then it's going to be received by a dog and a cat and a plant. And so it's quite oblivious of these borders. And in meditation practice, the breath is also considered like this, almost like a subtle thread that can weave between the physical body and the astral or the energetic body, and start to shift the consciousness of your mind working with the breath. So I invited 108 people living in this area in Squamish to let me record the sound of their breath cycles. And then I used these sounds to create a breath symphony. I also requested them to write down any words or phrases that came to them as they were concentrating on their breath. And so they put it down in a diary for me. And I created a poem out of their words. And then I used my finger to trace out these words in their handwriting on a sheet of glass that was allowed to fog up, as if done with exhalations, like, that visual form that is given to breath. And I took some photographs of this and I ran them in a sequence so that this poem would appear word by word. And I created this screen, which I sanded to look like it was a cloud outdoors in nature. And on the screen then was projected this poem, sentence by sentence, accompanied by the sound of people's breath cycles. So my mother was a really accomplished embroiderer, and she passed away in 2013. And as a way of, reconnecting with her, I found some of these old letters that she'd written to me when I was living in Chicago. And I started to trace out her words, and then I started to embroider them on fabric. And I wasn't quite sure why I was embroidering, because I've never been very good at embroidery. But I just assumed it's, because it was her medium and it made me feel closer to her. But then partway through this letter that I was embroidering, I suddenly realized that I was getting a certain feeling of comfort, knowing that, in embroidery, that mark is really like the words are tied to that ground fabric. It's not just like a drawing where if I draw it, I can just rub it out. But here they're really secured. And I guess, that's what I wanted. But ironically, when I got done with this letter and at the end of it, it felt to me like these words were protesting being stuck, and they didn't like being stuck like this. And so I re-embroidered this letter on a translucent fabric, but that didn't quite seem to work either. And I then started to cut the fabric around the words, and that just, looked clumsy. And at this point, I invited this embroiderer to come and work with me full time, who had actually worked with my mother for many years before that. And he told me about this soluble fabric. And he said, why don't you try that? And so I embroidered her letter on this soluble fabric. And when I was done, I just dissolved the fabric away, and I was just left with these lace-like words that were permeated with space. And it felt like that's what these words wanted. My mother was also an amazing gardener. And as I mentioned earlier, we lived in many different houses, different states. And she would always create these incredible magical gardens for us. So much so that when it was time for us to leave the house, there would always be a queue of people wanting that house because of these magical gardens that she'd made. And so I also started to embroider in a similar fashion the plants from her garden that she would press in books and send to me in these letters. So bit by bit, this sort of skeletal archive of personal memory started to develop. And some of these pieces I would embed into plaster to look more like fossils in a way. This was done for a show that I called In the Garden. I should back up for a second and say this, that the Kochi Biennale piece that you saw, and this is something I find really fascinating about art, because, and I can talk about this later too with other examples from other projects, but there's a lot that sneaks in there that isn't your conscious subject matter. So what was happening during the Kochi Biennale was, it was quite challenging to make that project in the short time frame, and we couldn't have any fans on because the paper would fly, and then the illusion had to be lined up down to precision of a few millimeters, and it was 55 degrees in that room without the fans, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And apart from the physical challenges, there were several others. The electricity wasn't there. We didn't know how to draw. The camera would go off, etc. And each time I'd get stuck in this project and start to, wonder where to go next, I would sort of close my eyes and think of my happy place. And my happy place was this magical garden that I used to visit, that used to belong to this Swiss hermit who lived in Dehradun. And you'd walk out of this very busy street in Dehradun and cross the threshold into his garden, and the sound suddenly seemed to stop, and there was a different quality of light in this garden. There was a radiance in it. And so I would always think about this garden just to kind of calm myself down when I was in Kochi. And really surprisingly, when I looked at the visitors' book, the comments, at the end of the Biennale, when I had come to visit, about 80% of them had talked about, wow, it was like the experience of walking through a magical garden. Everyone talked about that. And so, this was kind of surprising for me because that was not the intention of that work at all, but it had snuck in there, the feeling of it. So the next show I did is called In the Garden, and I wanted to actually pay homage to that garden. So this show had a few different vantage points for how I saw the garden. And one was what I just showed you, which was the memory of the garden, the aftermath, the archive, the pressing, the preserving, the flattening out of the garden. And then there was this other version which had to do with the living expression of this luminous garden of light. And this is an immersive installation. I'm just going to reduce the volume so I can talk over it. This is an immersive installation that you walk through. And all these plant forms that you see that are appearing as projections were created by stop motion animation. So as I was embroidering the image of a plant, I would just keep taking photo after photo after photo. So it becomes a time-lapse image. And some are drawn and some are painted, and they're all projected on these transparent screens that you can walk through. And it shows the garden growing and blooming and dying and resurrecting. So again, all those natural cycles. And I'm just going to move forward a bit in this. That's the blooming cycle. Moving forward, this is when the plants start to decay. Okay. Also in this show was this piece called Light Threads, where I had embroidered 3 silk panels in this chinoiserie style, and I created an animation which I projection mapped onto it. And this animation showed the labor of creating this piece, but it also would just illuminate elements from the piece and start to activate them. So you would suddenly see these embroidered birds starting to move and the flowers starting to droop and bloom. So all these videos are on my website, sumakshi.com, and which is why I'm just sort of jumping through them and just showing you these tiny little excerpts. And then there were multiple versions and iterations of this particular idea. And here they were embroidered on layers of transparent fabric. Here I've painted on plaster. Sometimes they become large, like screens dividing a room. They become installations. This was at the Bhaudajilad Museum in Bombay. And I'd arranged this almost in a mock, like natural history style exhibit with these real and created both botanical and maritime specimens. And some were in vitrines. And this was in Belgrade, where I'd built this platform where all these flattened black plants seem to stand. Okay. So this is a work called Spectre of Images in Memory of the Gardener. And this was shown in New York in 2017. And this is a web-like tapestry, which has these fragmented images of plant forms. And because these forms are incomplete, it appears as a garden which is either in the process of unraveling and going back into its form as just plain raw thread, or perhaps it's a garden in the process of becoming. So it's a transient image, either pointing to the future or to the past. And thread as a raw element is quite prominent in this work. And I installed this work about a foot away from the wall. And so it levitates like this ghost in front of the wall. And this is from an angle where you can actually see the work. I just wanted you to see the language of it. But what actually happened in that space was quite mysterious because, you know, the work completely disappeared. It was a white work on a white wall, and it registered only through its shadows. But what would happen is even people that were standing a foot away from the piece would be looking at the shadows and they'd be asking me, wait, have you drawn something on the wall or have you projected something on the wall? Like, what is going on? Like, they couldn't quite see it. And it's only when they were close enough that their breath moved the piece and the shadow moved that it, you know, that they realized or registered that something was there. So this was actually sort of a wonderful surprise for me as well. It wasn't an intentional thing, but I really liked how that happened. And then the garden starts to become three-dimensional. It becomes immersive. People can walk through it. And this was done for this museum in Israel, which was in the middle of a kibbutz. And I wanted to create this weightless, levitating garden. And this is called a blueprint of before and after, with the idea being that either we're looking at the aftermath or the ghost of a garden that once existed, or perhaps we're just looking at this blueprint of a garden that's in the either and is about to manifest fully. And people from this community would come back, you know, time and time again to visit this installation, and they would come in their lunch break and just sit there. And they told me that for them, it really created this space of mindfulness and silence and solace even. I'm going to skip this particular project. This was the Hermes windows, which I had worked on. And then, of course, we can talk about it during the question answers if you want to ask. So this brings me to a body of work that I sometimes am still currently engaged with. But this is the first iteration of this body of work, and it's called 33 Link Road. And 33 Link Road is the address of my grandparents' house in Delhi. They moved here during partition from the Pakistan side, and they built this house very shortly after partition. But the house was built in several stages. And it's been our family home for over 70 years. And it's been the site of, you know, innumerable family gatherings, sleepovers, shared stories, meals. My cousin was married in this house. My mother was born in the back room of this house. My grandfather died in this house. It was listed as our permanent address in all our official documents because, you know, like I said, we lived all over the country. And year after year, whether I lived in Chicago or France or Italy or Baroda or Madras or Hyderabad or, you know, Bihar, we would come back to this house and it always felt like, oh, 33 Link Road is always there, you know? So it almost had this unspoken promise of permanence or constancy. After both my grandparents died, you know, this house was left unoccupied. And each time I would drive by, its sort of solid sheltering surfaces would feel a little less solid and a little more vulnerable. And I wanted to, you know, it was like a form that had been done serving its function. And so I wanted to convert these solid surfaces of concrete and brick into something very ethereal and insubstantial, like a memory. And also one of my most common memories of this house is sitting in the garden and knitting and embroidering with my grandmother. And so I really wanted to convert these architectural surfaces into thread. And so I went into the house and I started to measure all these architectural details, like every grill, every bolt, every hinge, every door handle. And because this house was built in stages, There's no two hinges which are the same size and no two chitkanis that are the same size. One is 9.1 inches and one is 9.4 inches. And I really started to spend time with all these details and these idiosyncrasies in the house. And then I came back to my studio and I made these life-size drawings of these details and then, recreated them in thread with every hinge and every welding blob and everything as accurately as I could. And for me, this exactitude was an act of devotion or an act of love for this house that had meant so much to us. And this was at the Sumakshi gallery when I first displayed it. And it was displayed as this layered labyrinth to echo this idea of these layers or veils of memory that one starts to walk through. There was also a thread-based drawing I made of the gate, which I embedded in paper pulp and made my own paper out of. A year later, this was shown at the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art. And here, I wanted this architecture to turn even more ghost-like. I wanted it to look like spectral cobwebs. And so I kept the room white. And instead of lighting the pieces, I actually lit the walls around it. So these pieces were all a little bit backlit, and they had this feeling of being an X-ray or a silhouette as you moved through it. Okay. And these are some images of people walking through the installation. So right after this show happened, COVID hit. And everything was in lockdown, as you know. And I can't think of another time in my lifetime where we, as a collective we, not just people from one country, but people from all over the world, have lived for this extended period of time with this feeling of vulnerability. And this vulnerability that came from, well, confronting our own mortality and the mortality of our loved ones, but also this vulnerability that seemed to seep in as our system started to collapse or unravel at least. So like our medical systems and our economic systems and our social systems, many of us didn't go for the cremations of loved ones and family members. We couldn't go give our condolences at the time. So I think a lot of the work that I created in and around the time of COVID has this heightened sense of vulnerability to it. And I was also feeling that we were on this cusp of a shifting world rhythm. And I wondered whether it would allow for this shape-shifting of our stories and our identities and our ideologies. And this work that I made, called as Structure Dissolves, is an animation that's about 10 minutes long, but I'm just showing you tiny excerpts. And so this doorway from 33 Link Road appears stitch by stitch. And after 5 minutes, it's completed. And then it sort of hovers for just a moment, and then it starts to mutate and shapeshift. And at first, it feels like this doorway is resisting the change in its form, like it doesn't want to stop being a door. And then eventually it sort of gives in and releases its form and goes back to being the material that it was made out of, which is thread. And in doing so, it, takes on this like galactic shape, almost like something offering its material back to the stars. And this question was very much in my mind about, what happens to forms when they're done serving their function. And this space of 33 Link Road that was going through this entropy, it was the same time, we went to immerse my grandmother's ashes in the water. And I was just thinking about this form that is just now, being released, and what is the afterlife of this particular form. This was another work that I did during the COVID time, which was called On Time and Its Witness. So the other thing that happened for me during COVID was this pause in this frenzied activity of the Anthropocene, I think allowed me to relook at my relationship to time. And I felt that for many of us as adults, at least, it was the first time that we had the chance to discover our own natural rhythms that weren't dictated by deadlines. And I felt that perhaps each one of us carries these different rhythms of time inside ourselves. There's like a surface rhythm of time, which seems a little more structured and externally oriented and deadline based and can be frantic. And there are these inner rhythms which might be slower, like something that reveals itself to you if you're out walking in nature or you're just observing your breath. And so in this work, there is a white fern that hangs out on the wall as this silent spectator. And facing it in the middle of the room is this black fern. And from the base of the black fern, this shadow slowly starts to emerge and it elongates and it starts to rotate and it's skewing and it's moving around it at a really slow pace. In fact, it takes over 10 minutes to complete a rotation. And it does it in a manner that's very reminiscent of a sundial. And then as it starts to come back to the center, a second shadow emerges. And this is another movement of time. And this is an unvarying shadow. It doesn't skew, it doesn't distort. It just moves like a clock mechanically around. And then a third and a fourth and a fifth movement of time start. And each movement starts to go faster than the previous one. And they start to overlap and blur, creating these resonances and harmonies or dissonances. And then finally, everything just disappears because it goes so fast, except for that one original rhythm, which then slowly comes back to center. This work, called Synonyms, was inspired by a Borges short story that I was reading. This short story is called On Scientific Exactitude. And it's a fascinating story, just about a paragraph big. And in this, he describes an empire which is obsessed with scientific exactitude. And the king of this empire hires these cartographers to create a map of the empire. And they end up making this map so detailed that actually it becomes the same size as the empire. So now there's no place to put this map anywhere. So they have to lay it over the empire. And so point for point, the symbol of the place starts to cover the thing it is meant to represent. And people visiting this empire start to interact with the symbol instead of the original, confusing the double for the original thing. And then over time, eventually that map starts to crumble and it becomes part of the territory, further complicating this relationship between the real and the symbolic. In this particular work, Synonyms, it's like a web made out of threads, and they converge at some points to create these images of these plant forms. And in some places, these thread embroideries of these plant forms are covered by their counterpart, which are the real dried plants. So the embroidery and the plant are actually identical. And seen from one side, what you see is the embroidered image, and seen from the other side, what you see is the real plant, with the idea being that over time, the natural will start to crumble, decay, and fall, and finally leave, just the ethereal registrations on that web. This is another body of work called Soulmates. And Soulmates is a series of diptychs that feature these incomplete dried plants, which are mended and completed with thread embroidery. It consists of two halves that mirror each other exactly, except that what is plant on this side becomes thread on the other side, and what is thread on this side becomes plant on the other side. So this idea is that they're always completing each other. And then as the real parts of the plant might start to crumble and disappear over time, the counterpart, the mirrored panel, will always have the image, the original image of that plant intact. So in some way, the essence of that plant stays intact. And while neither one of these plants is whole, neither one of them is whole, yet each half seems to hold the complete essence. So weaving this sort of narrative of wholeness and reflection and symmetry and interconnectedness. And this is another version where I wanted it to look more like a textile pattern with booties on it. And again, these are some process images of cutting the leaves out and putting, aligning them in various places. And also towards the end of COVID, the architectural forms sort of give up their rigidity and their integrity as these forms and slowly start to collapse and give way to their materiality. This was at the Queensland Gallery of Modern Art in Australia. And here what happens is the architectural details from 33 Link Road start to become more isolated and more fragmented. And I've also started now to embroider the shadows of these images. So this white door has this indigo blue shadow. And here you see the staircase is sort of folding in and collapsing upon itself. This is a show called Afterlife that I did in 2003. So Afterlife was about that lingering after image, the aftermath of loss, the effect that seems to stay on long after the cause has finished. And so this question that I asked earlier of what happens to form when it's done serving its function was very much present in my mind throughout this show as I was making it. And in this show, what one sees is although the essence of these forms are intact, like you can make out, you're looking at a spiral staircase, you're looking at a gate, you're looking at a door, but materially, the forms are a lot more raw and vulnerable. They're either fragmented or they're unraveling or they're, weightless or they collapse. So for example, here at the entrance, when you walk in, you can first see the form of this spiral staircase. However, it is slightly misaligned and it's fractured. And as you round the corner, you see this fragment of a staircase. And from this fragment, one can extrapolate what the whole would have been. And then one sees, this entire staircase, but it doesn't really register as an object. The viewer's body tends to encounter it more as an apparition or, like a mirage in the ether. It's weightless. Its substance has been taken away. And next to this staircase are these Veda doors, which start with being quite dense and maintaining their architectural integrity on the left. And then they start to get rarer and subtler until finally they just unravel into 3 threads at the end. And this is the fragment of a brick wall wrapped around a corner. This is the installation in the other room. This is the main gate of 33 Link Road, and it seems to be caught in this moment where it's giving way to entropy and it's unraveling back into its material. And it's quite large. It's about 22 feet by 8 feet. And again, while the essence of that gate is intact, materially the form is experienced as quite raw, as all the threads are exposed. And all the colors in this show were actually taken from fading blueprints, these ammonia prints that have these blues and pinks and maroons in them. And because of these thousands of threads on this particular work, there were multiple shadows that were cast. So it created this visual blurring, and the gate appeared more as a kind of lingering impression rather than a sharply defined image. And in many details in the show, the shadows seem to be more present than the physical object. So again, that the effect seems stronger than the cause. And this is the final room inside the show, where I physically embroidered the shadows of this main gate. And on the left side, this shadow is actually lifted off the ground by a few inches. So now this shadow starts to cast its own shadow as well. And that's me working on the installation. This is a 3-dimensional version of the spiral staircase called Ascent. And again, if one looks at the individual treads of this staircase, it seems like they've been giving way to entropy and starting to lose their substance. And this was in Baroda. I'm going to skip 1 or 2 slides here. Okay. So my neighborhood in Gurgaon has changed quite a lot over the last 10, 12 years. I used to walk through this neighborhood and, enjoy looking at all these different sorts of houses, all done in their unique styles. There's somebody that would have used a Jaipur style with jharokas, and somebody would have put ionic pillars outside their houses. And so, they were all lovingly unique in their own way. But over the last 10, 12 years, one by one, all these houses have been demolished and they're being replaced by these builder flats. And as one walks, one can see these, just like the vulnerable belly of these private spaces left exposed. And it feels a little bit raw. And 33 Link Road, of course, has also now been up for demolition and has been demolished. And as I was thinking about that, I created this particular installation for Vadera Art Gallery. So I was thinking about Rumi's statement that the wound is where the light enters. And it always makes me think of the kintsugi technique in Japan, where they repair the broken pottery by using real gold to highlight the cracks. And I feel like that also highlights the value in this painful breakdown of the familiar. I was also thinking about Indian saris, and when they were old and fraying, they were often burnt to melt down and recover any of the precious metals that were left in the zari, so the gold and the silver, thus allowing that gold to resurrect into new forms. And so gold's inert, unchanging nature and its immunity from rust has, brought it connotations of immortality, of transcendence, of incorruptibility in many cultures. And so the use of gold zari to create these broken forms, for me, allowed this dialogue to happen between decay and what lies untouched by entropy, between the ruined and what remains intact, and between the temporary and the long-lasting, between form and the essence. And these are some of the details from this show. In 2003, I was invited to respond to the collection at CSMVS Museum. And I found myself very attracted to the Indian Sculpture Gallery. And I couldn't help thinking about how all these sculptures had been uprooted from their original context. And I couldn't find much information about their original context. The museum didn't seem to have much of that. And so I ended up emailing Rashmi ji, actually, and working with another art historian to discover what the original context of these sculptures were. And then I created, these ethereal traces of their lost environment that these sculptures belonged to. And they were placed just behind them to hang out like this subtle memory of the space that they came from. So this is a Chola Dwarpal, and the column that I created was based on elements from various Chola columns, especially taken from the Brihadishwara temple. And here the Parel Shivas from the 6th century. So I was looking at patterns of friezes from the Gupta period for this. So you see that, the conch shell at the bottom and the waves of Om rising, and all of these were these, friezes from the Gupta period. And working with these columns and this historical input, I think inspired this body of work, which is called Monuments. And, the idea of monuments is that they endure. They're solid and defiant against time. And in a way, they're there to allow the voices and the ideologies of their creators to continue long after they've died. So these are columns which are taken from the Qutub Minar complex in Delhi. And they originally belonged to Jain and to Hindu temples. And, now they've been absorbed into this Islamic complex. And so I think of them as these, silent witnesses to shifting histories. And the artwork turns these really dense, monumental columns into something very fragile and porous, into something that's like a membrane, and their disintegrating images start to feel vulnerable to time and to the erosion of history. And as we know, history books are constantly edited and re-edited and re-edited, often to suit the voice of the party in power. So this question of who are we building these monuments to, and whose voice lasts, what endures, which narrative stays, as this monument starts to collapse into 2 dimensions. And this was another version of this project that was shown in Jodhpur recently for a show that was called Surface. And Surface was a show about embroidery, and embroidery traditions from, over the country. And this is another layer to the work that I often think about, which is that embroidery, which was largely women's labor domestically, has historically been regarded inferior or secondary to weaving because it's not actually essential to the core structure of the fabric. It's considered just surface embellishment. And this hierarchy for me mirrors the broader framing of women's labor as seen as supplementary rather than foundational. But what starts to happen in these pieces is that because they are embroidered on a soluble fabric and that fabric is dissolved away, finally, what was once just surface embellishment ends up becoming the core structure because there is nothing else holding it together. It is only that. And there are other versions of these columns that I've been experimenting with using copper wire, using copper zari. I also plan to start oxidizing these. So I've bought a bunch of chemicals, some sulfur and ammonia and salt and whatnot to start to oxidize and patina these pieces. This was a show at the Kiranadar Museum, also in 2023. And the theme of this show was Prussian blue. So all the artists were invited to come and respond to this particular theme. And I did some research on Prussian blue, and there are many fascinating things about it, including the fact that it's the world's first synthetic pigment. You can get cyanide out of it, so it's poison, but also it can be used to stop radioactivity poisoning that people go through. So there's many interesting histories to Prussian blue. But the one that I was most attracted to was that Prussian blue is a light-sensitive pigment. And because of this, it enabled architects to be able to create blueprints. And I used a variation of this blueprint process called cyanotype. And in cyanotype, what you do is you basically mix these two chemicals and you coat the surface of your paper or fabric or thread with it. And you expose it to the sunlight. And the parts that catch the sun turn this beautiful, brilliant Prussian blue color. And the parts where you block the sunlight from reaching the image remain white. And since, light was a key material ingredient in the creation of this process, I also wanted light to be the subject matter. So I went around, collecting these images of light as it was registering through my windows on the wall and on the floor. And then I stitched these images together to create these negatives and then placed them on the chemical coated paper in the sunlight to get this beautiful Prussian blue color. And the poetic paradox of this for me was actually the areas that were denied light are the ones that finally register as an image of light. So all those white parts were actually blocked from receiving the sunlight. And so here it is images of light that are created by light. And I also wanted a more immersive feeling to this body of work. And so I created this installation which looks like rays of light coming in. And again, the pattern that they form on the floor are the same patterns cast by my window on the floor. And the way I did this was to actually go into the space and create a sketch in space to see how I wanted it to look. And then I took measurements of it and I embroidered a piece to match those dimensions and then coated them with cyanotype chemicals and exposed them to the sun. And then once it was made, I created a grid on that floor piece that, wasn't a square grid, but rather a trapezoid one, as if a grid seen in perspective. And there was a corresponding grid with the same number of nails on the wall. And then one thread was run from the wall to its corresponding spot on the floor. And Also, all these threads you're seeing have got the blue color because they've been exposed to sunlight. They're also done with cyanotype process. And this was really a long process because I had to unspool and unravel all the thread. And then it has to be pitch dark in the studio when you start to coat it with the cyanotype chemical because it's light sensitive. And then they have to be taken up one by one and exposed to the sunlight. And you have to keep rotating them to make sure different sides of that one thread are catching the sun. And then they're washed. And this was the result. And I also did these pieces of cyanotype and silk thread. So this series that I'm showing you are a few different shows where I was asked to respond to specific themes. This is a show that happened at the Crafts Museum on Ikat, curated by the Devi Art Foundation and Mayank Singh. And, you know, Ikat is a really crazy mathematical process. I'm not sure if you know how Ikat is woven, but I'll tell you briefly. They take thread and they calculate what the images they want to make on the woven sari that they're going to create. And based on that, they calculate which parts of the thread they're going to tie-dye which color. And so they cover it up and they dye it and they do this multiple times. And they calculate it so precisely that when they start to weave it, that image magically starts to appear. So it really is quite a mind-boggling process. So I did something like 50 or 70 small tests to try and figure out how I could make this work. And then I finally created this spiral staircase for this show. And each thread is again dyed blue and white, etc. And there are many parts of this that you can see wrapped in thread to refer back to the tie-dye process that it came from. And now what I'd like to end with are just, you know, some snippets of these more unresolved ideas that I'm still working on. I did a short residency at Khoj that triggered some ideas. And I made a series of these animations and videos that explored these themes of temporality, of fragility, collapse and regeneration in these shape-shifting ideas that we have of home and of the world. So to explain, these are just little excerpts from some of the videos. So my hand appears with this inked brush on the surface of water and attempts to draw this image of a boat. And this attempt is repeated over and over and over again. And of course, the boat starts to dissolve because I'm trying to paint it on the surface of water. And the insistence of this action in imprinting a form on a field that refuses to hold it finally results in this swirling black cloud of dispersed ink. And there's, of course, you know, the poignancy in the fact that a boat is supposed to float on water or save you from water, but here's a boat that's actually drowning in it. And on the other side of the diptych is this model of a soluble paper house that's suspended above these rising waters. And as the water starts to rise, the house starts to dissolve and fall apart. And these were several other explorations and animations along the same lines that I was working on. And one series of them was called Endings Are Beginnings Are Endings. And for this series, I researched maps of the world as they've been understood and drawn through the centuries. So there were maps by Anaximander in Greece from the 2nd century. There were maps by Posidonius. There were maps by Al-Idrisi in the 11th century from the Middle East. They're maps from China, they're Jain cosmology maps from India, they're Christian maps from Italy. So there are these various images of our world and where we thought we lived. And I did a series of these videos where I embroidered these maps onto the soluble fabric. And one by one, you see these worlds starting to dissolve. And then as one world image falls, then another one rises behind it. And as that one starts to fall, another one rises behind it. So it's all these various ideas of our world that are just rising and collapsing and falling. And here is just a little excerpt to show you what it looked like. And when I show this, I want it projected really large. So you feel almost, immersed in these layers of worlds that are falling apart and coming into being. Okay. And this was a recent show where we were asked to respond to the theme of lost in translation. And when the curator first shared this theme, it triggered many ideas, and I started thinking about all the different ways in our everyday life that there is a loss in translation between, intention and execution, between absolute ideals and then their relative expression in the world. I thought about art making as a form of alchemy. I thought about time and entropy and how they can erode and transform meaning. And then I started to research memory. And I was interested in memory because I think it is something that many thought leaders talk about as being essential to our understanding of who we are, where we stand, and where we're going. So in a sense, if the past has not been understood, you don't know who you are. So in a way, it's almost like this anchor for identity. But then there is all this other information about memory that has been presented, which is that memory can be repressed, memory can be manipulated, memory can even be created, and that it's an unreliable translator, and that translation through memory has the inevitable losses and additions to it. And so this piece is sort of about these contradictory statements about memory, and asking, if our sense of identity is based on something so fragile, so unreliable, so ever shifting, then where does that leave us? Not just as individuals, but also currently we see a lot of countries trying to go back to what they were, to go back to the glory days. And this memory of what they think, they were in the past might be suspect. So I created this layered tapestry of these floating white woven words, which are almost invisible because they're against a white wall. And although you can't read them through their physical presence, you can read them through their shadows. And this for me, again, was about the language of memory, which is this language of shadows and layers and these shifting words and things being in flux. And along with this, I had also created another video that was shown for Lost in Translation. And this is the last work I'm going to show today. And this is called Looking for Absolutes in a Relative World. And this documents me writing sentences on the surface of water with ink. And I'm not showing the video because it's 45 minutes long. But each one of these sentences or phrases articulates this yearning for certainty or permanence or stability. But even before these words can form, they of course start to bleed and ripple and distort and lose their coherence, echoing, the unattainability of this pursuit. So this is about projecting these impossible desires into a field that is not designed to fulfill them. And these are, these are the sentences that I had, these are some of the sentences that I had written out on the surface of water. And I thought I would maybe end with this because I feel like they quite nicely sum up some of the things I've been thinking about. So looking for absolutes in a relative world, attempting to hold on to what cannot stay, trying to reach what cannot be reached by trying. So to end with, I'd just like to say that, in case it isn't obvious already, for me, making art is my primary way of processing where I am within myself and within the world. I often come into the studio with a sort of urgent feeling inside that wants to be explored or understood, and not understood by my mind, which will treat it like an external object to be analyzed from the outside, but it wants to be spent time with. It wants its qualities known and experienced. And it could be a feeling of upliftment and inspiration, or it could be a feeling of dissonance inside that I can't quite give a voice to. And then often there's an impulse to just pick up a material and start working with it. And as I start to work with this material and I start to refine it outwardly, I find that something inside starts to also get refined and processed. And so for me, creative practice really is quite alchemical. And it's about self-transformation for me. And it allows for these undigested experiences to, I think, open up, to heal, and to be reintegrated. And I feel, really lucky to be participating day in, day out in this world where the rules are quite open that allow for this sort of self-discovery. And I have many different bodies of work, as you've seen. When I look it all together, sometimes I see these common threads that are going through them. These threads of the part that is, or a fragment that is seeking the whole, or about them being explorations of space, and space as a physical place, as site, as history, as architecture, but also the space between things and the space behind things and the space that permeates things, and being in multiple spaces at the same time. The spaces inside us, spaces of memory, spaces of imagination. And the work is also, of course, about time, about different rhythms of time. Often these installations require viewers to really slow down in order to be able to perceive them or experience them. But they're also about time as entropy, time as change, time as memory, time as dissolution. And a lot of the work is about perception and how perception is contingent on space and time, and how we are co-creators in our own reality based on how we give permission to our perceptions. And a lot of these works, I feel, articulate worlds which exist just before or after a world that has been solidified or condensed by our perceptions. So the rules seem to be more liquid in these worlds, and things haven't yet been defined. So they have the potential to be background or foreground. They have the potential to be an image or an object. They have the potential to be an illusion or to be real. They can be art or not be art. The option is to manifest or just stay in the ether in this insubstantial way. So they sit in this primordial soup of potential energy where these polarities haven't yet been defined. And so it allows us to look at them again and to reevaluate what they are. So thank you so much. This has been a long, long talk.
Thank you, Sumakshi. It's been an extraordinary talk.